The Battle of Leipzig, or Battle of the Nations, was fought 16 to 19 October 1813, at Leipzig, in Saxony. The coalition armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, led by Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Carl Philipp, Prince of Schwarzenberg, decisively defeated the French army of Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. Napoleon's army also contained Polish and Italian troops, as well as Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine. The battle was the culmination of the 1813 German campaign and involved nearly 600,000 soldiers, making it the largest battle in Europe prior to World War I. Being decisively defeated for the first time in battle, Napoleon was compelled to return to France while the coalition hurried to keep their momentum, invading France early the next year. Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to Elba in May 1814. Background: the French Emperor Napoleon I attempted to militarily coerce Tsar Alexander I of Russia into rejoining his unpopular continental system by invading Russia with about 650,000 troops, collectively known as the Grande Armée Écoutée, and eventually occupied Moscow in late 1812, after the bloody yet indecisive Battle of Borodino. However, the Russian Tsar refused to surrender even as the French occupied the city, which was burnt by the time of its occupation. The campaign ended in complete disaster as Napoleon and his remaining forces retreated during the bitterly cold Russian winter, with sickness, starvation, and the constant harrying of Russian Cossack marauders and partisan forces, leaving the Grande Armée Écoutée virtually destroyed by the time it exited Russian territory. Making matters even worse for Napoleon, in June 1813 the combined armies of Great Britain, Portugal, and Spain, under the command of Britain's Arthur Wellesley, Marquis of Wellington, had decisively routed French forces at the Battle of Vittoria in the Peninsular War, and were now advancing towards the Pyrenees and the Franco-Spanish border. With this string of defeats, the armies of France were in retreat on all fronts across Europe. Anti-French forces joined Russia as its troops pursued the remnants of the virtually destroyed Grande Armée Écoutée across Central Europe. The Allies regrouped as the Sixth Coalition, comprising Russia, Austria, Prussia, Sweden, Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, and certain smaller German states whose citizens and leaders were no longer loyal to the French Emperor. Napoleon hurried back to France and managed to mobilize an army about the size of the one he had lost in Russia. But severe economic hardship and news of battlefield reverses had led to war weariness and growing unrest among France's citizenry. Despite opposition at home, Napoleon rebuilt his army, with the intention of either inducing a temporary alliance or at least cessation of hostilities, or knocking at least one of the great powers of the coalition out of the war. He sought to regain the offensive by re-establishing his hold in Germany, winning two hard-fought tactical victories, at Lutzen on the 2nd of May and Bautzen on 21 May, over Russo-Prussian forces. The victories led to a brief armistice. He then won a major victory at the Battle of Dresden on the 27th of August. Following this, the coalition forces, under individual command of Gebhard von Blücher, Crown Prince Charles John of Sweden, Karl von Schwarzenberg, and Count Benningsen of Russia, followed the strategy outlined in the Trachenberg Plan. They would avoid clashes with Napoleon, but seek confrontations with his marshals. This policy led to victories at Grossbeeren, Kulm, Katzbach, and Dennewitz. After these defeats, the French emperor could not easily follow up on his victory at Dresden. Thinly stretched supply lines spanning now somewhat hostile Rhineland German lands, coupled with Bavaria's switching of sides to the coalition just 8 days prior to the battle, made it almost impossible to replace his army's losses. As a result, by the time of the battle, The total strength of all coalition armies east of the Rhine probably exceeded 1,000,000. By contrast, Napoleon's forces had shrunk to just a few 100,000. Prelude. With the intention of knocking Prussia out of the war as soon as possible, Napoleon sent Marshal Nicholas Oudinot to take Berlin with an army of 60,000. Oudinot was defeated at the Battle of Grossbeeren, just south of the city. With the intact Prussian force threatening from the north, Napoleon was compelled to withdraw westward. He crossed the Elbe with much of his army between late September and early October, and organized his forces around Leipzig to protect his crucial supply lines and oppose the converging coalition armies arrayed against him. He deployed his army around the city, but concentrated his force from Taucher through Stotteritz, where he placed his command. The Prussians advanced from Wartenburg, the Austrians and Russians from Dresden, and the Swedish force from the north. Opposing forces. The French had around 160,000 soldiers along with 700 guns plus 15,000 Poles, 10,000 Italians, and 40,000 Germans belonging to the Confederation of the Rhine, totaling to 225,000 troops on the Napoleonic side. The coalition had some 380,000 troops along with 1,500 guns, consisting of 145,000 Russians, 110,000 Austrians, 90,000 Prussians, and 30,000 Swedes. This made Leipzig the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, surpassing Borodino, Wagram, Jena and Auerstadt, Ulm, and Dresden. The French Grande Armée Écoutée, under the supreme command of Emperor Napoleon, was in a weakened state. The majority of his troops now consisted of teens and inexperienced men conscripted shortly after the near destruction of the Grande Armée Écoutée in Russia. Napoleon conscripted these men to be readied for an even larger campaign against the newly formed Sixth Coalition and its forces stationed in Germany. While he won several preliminary battles, his army was being steadily depleted as coalition commanders, closely following the Trachenberg Plan, systematically defeated his marshals. The French imperial cavalry was similarly insufficient, making it difficult for Napoleon to keep his eyes on his lines of communications or even scout enemy positions, a fact which influenced the outcome of the Battle of Grossbeeren and others during the German campaign. The coalition army was organized into 4 army-level commands: the Austrian Army of Bohemia under Karl von Schwarzenberg, the Prussian Army of Silesia under Gebhard von Blücher, the Russian Army of Poland under Levin August von Benningsen, and the Swedish Army of the North under Charles John Bernadotte. The Swedes also had under their command a company of the British Rocket Brigade armed with Congreve rockets, under the command of Captain Richard Bogue. Preparations. Napoleon's plans. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon planned to take the offensive between the Pleiße and the Parther rivers. Their position at Leipzig held several advantages for his army and his battle strategy. The rivers that converged there split the surrounding terrain into many separate sectors. Holding Leipzig and its bridges, Napoleon could shift troops from one sector to another far more rapidly than could the Allies, who had difficulty moving such large numbers of troops into a single sector. The northern front was defended by Marshals Michel Ney and Auguste de Marmont, and the eastern front by Marshal Jacques MacDonald. The artillery reserve and parks, ambulances, and baggage stood near Leipzig, which Napoleon made his supply base for the battle. The bridges on the Pleiße and White Elster rivers were defended by infantry and a few guns. The main battery stood in reserve, and during battle was to be deployed on the Gallows Height. This battery was to be commanded by the artillery expert Antoine Drouot. The western flank of the French positions at Wachau and Liebitwolkwitz was defended by Prince Joseph Poniatowski and Marshal Pierre Augereau and his young French conscripts. Coalition's plans with the 3 monarchs of the Continental Coalition powers. Tsar Alexander I of Russia being at the head of the three, along with King Frederick William III of Prussia and Emperor Francis I of Austria. Present in the field, a substantial staff supported the coalition commanders. Tsar Alexander I was also the supreme commander of all coalition forces in the Eastern Front of the war, while Prince Schwarzenberg of Austria was the commander-in-chief of all coalition forces in the German theater. For the Tsar, this was the second time that he had filled in as a battlefield commander since Austerlitz almost a decade prior during the War of the Third Coalition. Initially, the command was plagued with incompetence and petty rivalries in conflict with each other, and its operations were prone to the vanities of the monarchs, especially from the Russian emperor, but these largely evaporated as the battle raged on, with the command largely centering on the two main commanders during the battle. There was a drafting in the battle plan, and marshals Prince Volkonsky of Russia, Johann Christopher Toll of Sweden, and Karl Friedrich von dem Niesbeck and Gerhard von Scharnhorst of Prussia took part in the planning. After the first plan was drafted, Schwarzenberg submitted it to the monarchs. However, Alexander, the Russian emperor, complained about his incompetence in terms of battle planning upon seeing the plan for himself. Upon learning of Schwarzenberg's main plan, to call for a secondary attack on the bridge between Leipzig and Lindenau to be led by Blücher and Gaillet, and a main attack astride the Pleißer River to be led by Merveldt, Hessen, Homburg and the Prussian Guard, he insisted that this was a disastrous tactic, as it would not permit the coalition army to fully encircle and outflank that of Napoleon, or at least decisively defeat and destroy his army, giving him the potentiality of breaking the coalition battle line at one point, thus creating a gap, and then concentrate forces to it and to the weakened sectors. Thus would possibly give the latter a chance to regain the strategic initiative in Germany. The Prussian king attempted to opine to the Tsar, but could do nothing, so he treated the discussion as if it was none of his concern. But later events in the battle proved the Tsar's judgments correct. The action he had ordered Blücher to take met with great success north of Leipzig, and the actions of Russian Guard was decisive in halting the French all-out attack on Goldengosser in the south. On the other hand, the actions of Austrians along Pleißer River, part of Schwarzenberg's initial plan, ended in failure. However, not willing to plan the battle by himself as he had done during his disastrous defeat at Austerlitz almost a decade earlier, Alexander had Schwarzenberg draft another battle plan based on his thoughts and views. Schwarzenberg then drafted another plan that was largely designed to let everyone do as they pleased. The plan was as follows. Blücher's axis of advance was to be shifted northward to the Halle Road. The Russian and Prussian guards and the Russian heavy cavalry was to be amassed at Rotha in general reserve. The Austrian grenadiers and cuirassiers would advance between the rivers. This strategy would ensure the encirclement of the French army in Leipzig and its vicinity, or at least inflict heavy losses upon them to assure the needed decisive results. Seemingly, though somewhat reluctantly, convinced, Alexander soon agreed to his plan, and he then ordered him to tell the other commanders to follow the plan.